In the middle of a European summer, a shimmering haze over a city skyline is a familiar sight. Most media coverage frames these heat waves as temporary discomforts, extreme weather events that populations simply have to endure until the conditions return to normal. Analysts at the European Central Bank, Allianz, and MSCI categorize these same conditions differently. Their models classify extreme heat as a structural economic shock, placing it in the same data sets as financial crises or total supply chain collapses. European infrastructure, from the depth of its river channels to the cooling limits of its power plants, was engineered for the predictable temperature and rainfall patterns of the last century. To understand the future of the global economy, we have to look past the sky and identify 3 specific physical thresholds where heat mathematically triggers a system failure. The first threshold is located on the Rhine. This river serves as Europe's primary industrial artery, moving coal, chemicals, and raw materials into the manufacturing centers of Germany. The system depends on a single structural choke point, the Cobb gauging station. Navigation relies on a physical threshold of 78 centimeters. Below this line, fully loaded ships run aground. Suddenly, it takes 4 separate vessels to move the same cargo as one, creating an immediate transport capacity shortage. These 200 million tons of cargo cannot be shifted to other modes. The existing road and rail networks physically lack the surplus capacity to absorb the volume. The direct result is industrial paralysis. Just 30 days of low water at this choke point strips 1% off total German industrial production. The heat constraint also dictates the generation of power. Most of France's inland nuclear fleet, including the Bottleneck plant, is tied directly to the health of the surrounding rivers. These plants require massive, continuous withdrawals of river water to cool the reactors, returning that warmed water back into the ecosystem. This creates a second threshold, 28.5 degrees Celsius. Regulations mandate that downstream river temperatures cannot exceed this limit without risking the destruction of the local aquatic environment. When a heat wave pushes the river naturally close to this limit, the plant must deliberately throttle down its output or shut down completely to avoid violating the temperature cap. This creates a systemic paradox. Grid capacity collapses from heat exactly as air conditioning demand peaks. Beyond infrastructure and power grids, the heat constraint acts on the most fundamental economic engine, the human body. The third threshold is 30 degrees Celsius. Above this ambient temperature, the human cardiovascular system enters a state of acute strain. Data from Allianz shows that concentration and physical work capacity follow a steep mathematical decline. For every single degree the temperature rises above 30, labor productivity drops by 3%. This biological limit creates a crisis in outdoor sectors like construction and agriculture, manifesting as surging sick leave and collapsed work capacity. Human labor is biologically incapable of maintaining historical output levels in an environment that is structurally hotter. Simultaneously paralyzing the movement of materials, throttling the energy grid, and exhausting the labor force creates a supply-side shock that cannot be fixed by traditional monetary policy. MSCI data reveals the scale of corporate exposure. A majority of listed companies are currently operating with assets in areas facing multiple severe climate hazards. 55% of these companies face physical risks, representing over $1 trillion in potential lost revenue. For major European economies, these thresholds are projected to lock in hundreds of billions in GDP losses by 2030. The European Central Bank has identified a secondary effect. Because goods, energy, and labor become artificially scarce, this heat-driven shock fuels inflation, specifically driving up the price of food. If global warming reaches 2.7 degrees, the compound impact of these shocks is projected to reduce the average European household income by 27%. This level of wealth destruction would push an estimated 127 million Europeans into poverty. The temperature of the air now sets the upper bound for economic growth. The movement of the mercury has become a hard physical ceiling on the speed and scale of the modern world.